Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this session. We're in concurrent session 3. There are 4 presentations in this session. The first presentation will be, we're in room A, by the way, so I hope you're all in the right spot. Educational assessment and evaluation. There are 4 presentations. What we'll do is each session will have a 10 to 15 minute each presentation, 10 to 15 minutes presentation. I will give you a HOI at 10 minutes, then I'll give you a HOI at 12 minutes and another reminder at 14 minutes. At 15 minutes, I will ask you to stop speaking so that we can keep to time for the session. And then we'll have a few minutes for some questions. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of time at the end also to do some questions if we don't get to them all in that 20-minute period that we've allocated for each of the speakers. There's the theme for this session is educational assessment and evaluation. I'll just quickly let you know what this session is trying to achieve. It includes authenticity in assessment that incorporates academic integrity, such as reducing plagiarism or contract cheating, social innovation in assessment design, embedding clinical practice or work integrated learning into assessment, innovative techniques to ensure student success, quality of content and curriculum design, digital badging and micro-credentials and/or attrition and retention. So this is a session that's trying to collapse a lot of information into it. What I'll do is I will hand over to the first presenter, which is Jo Luck. Jo is going to be speaking on thesis proposals, supporting research high degree candidates to construct their confirmation of candidature submission. Now, what I'll ask all of the presenters to do is share your screen. If you've not done that before when you're doing your presentation, there's just a little green box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and it will share your screen. If anyone has any problems as we go through, I will walk you through it. Jo, we might start with you and kick off. I'll give you a HOI at 10 minutes and then 12, 14 and then 15. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Celeste. I appreciate the opportunity. Okay, thank you. Yes, so a very long title. I didn't realise how long it was until Celeste read it out. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm writing a reflective paper for a journal, which is using actor network theory to analyse this unit and how it went from, being a very tiny unit with only a few enrolments to now this term had 44 enrolments in it, which I know that there are much larger units in the university, but this unit is to do with our research high degree training. So that's very large numbers for that unit. So just to quickly say, actor network theory is a socio-technical theory that comes from constructivism, and it's all about forming more solid networks with actors, and the actors could be people or it could be things like policies, procedures, etc. So in this 10 to 15 minute presentation, I don't have enough time to explain actor network theory. I'd need a whole day workshop with you for that. So I'm really just going to talk about the movements or the translations that have happened over the last since 2012. So with this unit, RSCH 20001, prepare for confirmation. As I said, this is now it is now a compulsory unit that all research high degree students have to take before they do their confirmation of candidature submission. And so yeah, so as I said, I'm just talking about what's happened from in the beginning in 2012 till I took it over to the current day when it's doing now, and sort of how I've made connections or how connections are made, things were put together to make this, a much larger, more robust unit than it was before. So that's just an overview of the 4 things I'm talking about. So firstly, in the beginning, 2012, term 2, I took over what was called COIS, 2009 research methods. And it was a unit that was originally created within, I think it was the business faculty it was called then, and it was really for an honours unit for business and information and communication technology students. Very low enrolments, like, around like between 0 and 5, we're in there. And because it was such a small unit compared to other units within our school at the time, which, had 100 or more students in it. Very minimal development work had been done on the content. And most of the students were face-to-face anyway, so they just take classes with the students, etc., etc. It didn't have a learning management system presence, even when Moodle came on board, which I think was 2010. The previous unit coordinators still didn't think the need to have an LMS presence. So it was very much a tenuous little unit there that was just hanging on for dear life. I think in ICT, the last honours students, I don't even think had happened that decade. We had some in the previous decade, but there were a couple of business honours students around that time. So what happened after that? So in the following couple of years, I made connections with other schools. So they were, talking to staff in other schools, or staff had approached me, and they're saying, and mainly it was master students, because this was a unit in the master's suite of programs, and honours or masters, and people would say to me, I've got the student and they don't know anything about research methods or whatever. Can they be enrolled in the unit? And so I said yes. I said yes to all takers and with them in, even though they're coming from science disciplines, etc., where I didn't have the background in that. I let them in there, but I had said to the person, like the staff member who asked me, but I will need you to work with me. I'll need you to help me with this because I'm not an expert in that area. So what happened over those years is that I added a focus there of writing the thesis proposal. So prior to that, the unit was very much just about research methods, quantitative, qualitative, etc. I don't even think it mentioned mixed methods even. It was still that was still fairly new at that point in time. So, but one of the things with these master students who are coming in, who are research master students, is that they would say to me, I've got this thesis proposal to write as part of my confirmation. So I started adding content in there about, writing your thesis proposal, but it was just all stuff out of my own head, what I thought would make a good proposal within there, but also I shouldn't say just to pull it all out of my head. It was also, through reading, books and reading journals or whatever, what makes a good thesis proposal, that's what I put in there. And it went then also from a focus of being business and ICT focus. It also, in particular, there were science students mainly. Some nursing students also were enrolled at that time. So, I sort of, as I was building up the networks and making things bigger, making more connections, I also changed the content of the unit, or developed the content of the unit. So in the next phase, I think it was late 2014, that Susan Kinnear came on as the Dean of Graduate Research. And I know in 2015, she would talk to me about some candidates who were performing. Some candidates had been enrolled and some had been enrolled for a while and they still had not submitted their confirmation of candidature, or they had submitted it and it was being knocked back because it wasn't really well written. And so she talked to me about putting in, and I think from memory there were 6 students who at that time she put into the unit, or she asked me she put into the unit for me to help them, to give them more guidance about writing their thesis proposal. So at that stage, the focus changed again. So there were even more disciplines within there, and in particular, those new students that she added were people who had poor writing skills within there. So I added to the unit. The name was changed to Fundamentals of Research because it wasn't research methods anymore. So I went through the process of changing it to make it adequately reflect that the content had changed, got bigger. I added things about research language because some of the problems that I could identify with these students is they were reading journal articles and stuff and they just didn't understand the language. They didn't understand what they were reading. So I added that. I added about research processes to explain, the process of research. And again, you find even more the thesis proposal, what we had to go in there. So, and also because the discipline areas had increased, I was also putting more resources in there about the scientific method, but also, there are people doing qualitative studies, etc. Even some creative industry students were in there. When I say that, because I don't know much about the creative industry, so, I had to search and I worked through with other professors in the university about what could I add to this unit to help those people with the differing needs. Something that was really helpful to me was that in September 2016, the COC procedure was updated. And then finally, there was, Section A of the COC, it very clearly stated what the university expected for a thesis proposal. So after term 2, 2016, then, the assessments were changed and very much aligned to what was in the COC procedure. So much so that now, in 2019, the final assignment is perfectly aligned with what's in Section A of the COC policy and procedure. So that very definitely that unit is orienting students to do exactly what they need to do for Section A of the COC. So that the university, through that procedure, made it perfectly clear, clearly stated what the students had to do. That really helped that unit in that it helped with the assessment and defining the assessment, and then what I had to do to step those students through till they got to that stage of writing that final assessment. And with the final stage that I just wanted to discuss with you is that from 2018, the unit moved from being a unit that was like service taught from School of Engineering and Technology into the School of Graduate Research. It's now fully moved into the School of Graduate Research. And so, the research division now pays for my salary, and for the other people who are unit coordinators, that they pay money back to the schools to pay for us to do it. As part of that change, we also changed to prepare for confirmation to clearly indicate to the students and to their supervisors that that's what that unit does. It helps them with that COC submission. And enrolled in that was also the research high degree policies were changed to make it clear that it was compulsory. As I alluded to before, the assessment structure was changed so that it clearly scaffolds development of the COC proposal. And all through these different stages, this collaborative learning and teaching model has evolved to the stage that there's very clearly now a triangle of support. So there's the unit coordinator, there's the research high degree supervisors, and the candidates. So the candidates write drafts of assessments, they send them to the supervisors to give them feedback, and they must give the discipline input and the content to the COC submissions, and then it comes back to me and I mark it, give feedback as an independent critical reviewer of their COC within this unit, and then that leads them to, the following assignments, to approve their following assignments. And then lastly, the last assignment helps them to improve the COC submission.
That's 10 minutes, Jo.
Oh, thank you for that. This particular model is unique to COC. I've talked to a number of different universities about how they help students to write their COCs, and a lot of universities do offer support in various ways. Sometimes it's a formal course or a unit, but in others it's just, seminars, etc. that they do. But so far I've not found another university that does that model of having the coordinator, the supervisors and the candidates all working together on that. So that's the point of difference that we have. As I mentioned before, the final product is that Section A of the COC thesis, and this unit then steps them up to be to do that first milestone of a research high degree candidate, which is their COC. That is the first significant milestone that they have to do, and for many students, it's it's setting them up to what they're going to do if they're a master's for the following year and a quarter, or if they're a doctoral student for the following 2 to 3 years of their study. So for a lot of them, it is really a major step. It's probably one of the biggest pieces of work that they've had to write in a coordinated fashion. The Section A is usually about 10,000 words. Well, that's what's recommended in the policy. So as I said, so it is really significant, and it is on the basis then that they do the rest of their study. So just to sum up then, I was just, as I said, giving you a brief overview of what I'm writing this journal article about, just to talk to you about how through making connections with other people, other parts of the university, policies, procedures, whatever, you can go from having a unit which in some ways could have been
Oh, you're frozen, Joe. We've lost you. I can still see movement elsewhere, but I can't see or hear Joe. Can anyone else see or hear Joe? No? All right. Joe, we've lost you. Sorry. But that's time anyway. So I'm going to talk in your absence, Joe. While we're waiting for Joe to become unfrozen, does anyone have any questions for her? We can get her back eventually. All right, I think we've lost her completely now. All right, so I will, well, when Joe comes back, I might hold the questions for when she dials back in. If I know Joe, she'll dial back in, and we'll hold those questions after the next speaker. And then what we might do is just jump straight to the next session, which is the tyranny of distance, online learning, isolation, and attrition rates. So, Amanda Jane, this is you. So if you want to, well, go for it.
We're good? Okay, so this is a joint presentation by myself and my colleagues, Alexandra, McEwan and Victoria Lambropoulos. And we are a group of lecturers from the law school, which is totally online. So obviously that's why our talk is all about the frustrations of online learning and potentially how we can make online learning perhaps a little bit better. I'll hand over to Alex to give you a background, then we'll hand to Victoria, and then I'll sum up at the end. So Victoria, sorry, Alex.
Thanks, AJ. Hi, everyone. My name's Alex McEwan. I'm a lecturer in law at CQ. I'm just obviously here providing the background to the study, giving you some sort of theoretical framework for how the findings that AJ and Victoria will discuss fit in to a theoretical framework. First of all, I just wanted to talk briefly about the work of Vincent Tito, who's a sociologist and does a lot of work around tertiary education. And he's been writing for about 40 years, but what we're drawing on is a seminal article that he published in 1975, and the title of that article was Dropout from Higher Education, a Theoretical Synthesis of Recent Research. Well, what he was doing in that article is fairly self-explanatory from the title, but I just wanted to talk about what he wanted to do is develop a framework that explicated the processes that bring students to leave an institution of higher education. That was the aim of this framework. And within that framework, he brought together various factors, two in particular, what he called goal commitment and institutional commitment on the part of the student. And when he talked about goal commitment, this is sort of reflected or evidenced in grades and intellectual development that occurs during the learning journey for students. And then institutional commitment is about peer relationships and kind of interactions that students have and connections they have with faculty members. These two commitments to goals and institution is how students integrate into the tertiary education institution. So they integrate into that institution socially, when you think about universities as a social system, but also academically through their intellectual work and their grades. So what Tinto proposed with these forms of integration, the success or the lack thereof, are really the processes that we can trace and map to understand what contributes to students either dropping out as a voluntary act or through academic failure or other sort of related issues. So that's a kind of broad, very broad theoretical framework on attrition that we're referencing our work to. And I just want to fast forward now and into the sort of Australian policy environment on student attrition in tertiary education and highlight three recent studies. The first is that published by the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Report in 2017, and amongst a plethora of factors that contribute to student attrition in tertiary education, TESCA identified as the biggest risk factor was online enrolment. And as you can see in the graph that's at the top of the PowerPoint presentation, when we compare online students to their face-to-face counterparts, online students drop out 2 times more than their face-to-face counterparts there. Another recent study by the Higher Education Standards Panel, which was published in 2018, again found online study as a significant risk factor for attrition. So, but what's interesting is this third study that I want to talk about, which was published by the Grattan Institute last November, and it gives a bit more of a nuanced picture to this notion of online study as a risk factor for attrition. So similar to those previous reports, online study was identified as a risk factor. So too was part-time study and being a mature age student. In addition to that, if you think about those three risk factors within one student, you've got basically what's the worst case scenario in terms of attrition risk. Okay, however, in this Grattan report, where part-time and mature age were controlled against online study, what was found was that the mature age nature of the students and the part-time nature of the study accounted for a lot of that risk. And in fact, the online nature of study only increased that risk by around 2%. Okay, so given that policy and sort of, I suppose, contemporary evidence context, I just want to very briefly reflect on our cohort. Our cohort is Central Queensland University undergraduate law students. So we do law online, so 100% of our students are online. In terms of the cohort that our study pertains to, about 66% or 2/3 of our CQU law students are part-time students, and more than 80% of them are working full-time, and 3/4 of them are mature age students. Okay, so as you can see, in terms of, we have all the risk factors in our corner for student attrition, and obviously it's a priority issue for our discipline. In terms of where our study fits into all of that, we really compare and contrast the findings from a study published by Penny Rush in 2014. And Rush's study was again about online study, but her cohort was much, much larger than ours. She had, her study took into account online undergraduate and postgraduate students. There were over 1,000, I think it was 1,002 respondents to her questionnaire, and that questionnaire was developed and put forward on the basis of improving student support services to students. Now, what Rush really sort of based on kind of emergent themes from open-ended questions on those surveys, she really focused on the benefits and challenges associated with online learning, and the major themes were isolation, contact, and connection. So just to contrast that, as I said, our study cohort was undergraduate law students at CQU. And our method was, again, a survey with some collection of demographic information, but also opportunities to respond to open-ended questions in relation to experiences in study. And then the data collected was analysed using NVivo. And I'm now going to hand over to AJ to go into the findings of the study.
So thank you, Alex. So I'll talk about the interplay between flexibility, necessity, and working hours. So as you've already heard from Alex, the Rush study very influenced this study, and she found, in response to her question 3, which I'll read, I think it's important for me to read it out. What do you think is the best aspect of being a distance student? 50.5% noted flexibility, that was important, and 37% mentioned necessity. Now, in relation to necessity, Rush's work only speculated that that really meant work commitments. There was no real hard data to say that. And this is where this study is very important, and I'll speak to that in a moment. Now, we have two questions which I'll focus on in this slide. Question 26 is benchmarking Russia's question 3. Now, our question 26, in response to that, similar question to Russia's study, 105.2% said flexibility. Now, you'll wonder how we got to that figure, but I think really, in essence, some of the other questions also noted flexibility. So in essence, there were students that mentioned flexibility multiple times. That's why we got 105.2%. And 41.4% mentioned necessity. Now, those are the two big factors there. Now, so clearly flexibility is important, but where this study is really saying something and adding to this area is our question 19, which Rush did not have. And our question 19 said this: what were your reasons for choosing to study law online? Now, the responses were necessity 93.9%. So flexibility is not a choice, it's a necessity. And only 47.5% said flexibility. Now, we also broke down, or this study broke down what necessity meant into 3 basic components. The highest and most significant one was work commitments. That's 41.4%. And then closely followed by accessibility. Now, accessibility means accessibility to higher education. So presumably, they do not have a traditional bricks and mortar university close by that they can access. So this is why they are studying online.
That's 10 minutes, guys.
All right, thank you. So briefly, I just wanted to mention our images that we've got up here. Items clustered by word similarity, those were the clusters, and you can see in red necessity, accessibility, and flexibility. And then the second image, or the bottom image, you can see is the word, I guess you can see the word cluster that you've got there. But I'll hand it over now to AJ. I wanted to mention family commitments, but I think we're going to run out of time. I'll let Amanda Jane, sorry, continue.
AJ's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll speed it up, Celeste, no worries. So in relation to the other part of our, I guess the things we take away from Victoria's discussion was the big influence that work has on the demands of student time. A lot of the government reports mention that one of the really big risk factors for attrition is the part-time enrolment status of students. But really, it's not just about part-time enrolment. It is much more about, from what our study would indicate anyway, it's much more about work and the demands of work that these students are having to accommodate. The other part of our study related to isolation, and it had to do with, in fact, Russia's study was the reason why I kind of started off on this research trail, because my interest was in trying to mitigate feelings of isolation in the student cohort, given the theories around, Garrison's theory of online learning and the community of learners, and the big factor that social presence plays in that. Russia's study seemed to support the way I was thinking, which was if students are really isolated, then we need to be thinking about things to do for online students that will help break up.
That's 12 minutes.
Okay, that breaks up that sense of isolation. So we drilled into isolation more in our study, and again, you'll see a wacky figure of 109.2%. So a lot of every student and then some, mentioned some facet of isolation that they were feeling. Obviously supports Russia's study. We drilled down further using Tinto's benchmarks in terms of connection, as Alex mentioned at the front. And Tinto's model deals with connection to peers, connection to lecturers, and connection to the university. So we analysed the responses around Tinto's model, and by far and away it was connection to peers that was bothering students more than connection to lecturers or the university, although they did feel the lack of co-location more so with lecturers, oddly enough, than peers, which seemed to suggest that my idea of using Facebook might well fly in the sense of helping students to feel, online students, to feel more connected. However, we also got some rather other interesting new data for some extra questions that we included that, again, Rush didn't include. And they really, I guess you've got to take the big isolation factor here with a little bit of caution.
1 minute to go.
Sure. Because the other questions basically seem to indicate that 1 in 5 students was quite okay with having little or no contact with other of their students, and their mental health, so far as they perceived it, was quite good, and there was only 3 students that mentioned isolation. So I think there's more research to be done there in terms of isolation. So that's our study. Basically, the 2 big factors are the big impact that work has on the attrition rate in terms of studying online. Obviously, you can't say that there's a causal relationship because this is just a qual study, but I think there's certainly room for further research around that to try and drill down into whether there is causal relationships, exactly what the causal relationships are, and so forth. And I just wanted to mention Celeste Lawson's paper, which is awesome, and we have drawn on as well in relation to the idea of not being able to answer the attrition question with a top-down approach. It's got to be all about information sharing, networking, and that kind of stuff. It's only from a ground-up approach that can tackle a messy problem like attrition. So sorry about the rushed nature of the presentation at the end there, but that's our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, team. And because of the gratuitous mention of my paper, I've given you an extra 30 seconds, so well done. Okay, so does anyone have any questions for this research? It's fascinating. Obviously, attrition is something that I am particularly interested in, especially for online, because we at CQU, I mean, other universities and people who are joining this particular session may not have the same cohort that we do, and our cohort is at risk in nearly every single factor of their being, you know, online, low SES, working full-time, studying part-time, and so it's a risk upon a risk upon a risk. So it's particularly interesting for us when we're trying to cater for that online group. So does anyone have any questions? I'm looking for raised hands. I'm looking for comments. I can see a comment that's been posted by Ray and some other research that's been posted about student attrition. Thanks, Ray. Anyone got any questions? What we could do,
it's just Colleen, sorry to just put in there. I just wanted to make a comment. I just find the attrition thing really, really interesting, and especially with the nursing cohort as well. As I keep saying, it's really it's a real struggle sometimes to work out how to engage them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I sit and listen, and I just think, well, how do we actually manage to do that, like from week 1, and keep them, and you know, even though you've got the supports in there, it's how they actually manage it, and how do we make them responsible. It's like the old saying, isn't it? You can always bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so how do I just, yeah, after 5 years, I still struggle with how we do that, eh?
Yeah, and I think that everyone would agree that attrition is a macro issue that we in our little micro of the university can only do so much. So yeah, good point. All right, so I just see Ray's just expanded on her comment. Thank you, Ray. What we might do is if you've got any more questions, maybe hold them, and we'll come back if we've got time at the end of the session. So thank you very much for that presentation. We'll move on to the third presentation, and and get through. And then Joe, welcome back, Joe. Joe got booted out. Joe, there were a couple of questions. We'll come back at the end too for you. Okay, so the third presentation is performance judgments in work integrated learning, the role of clinical educator, inner dialogical voice, and Tracey Symes. Over to you, Tracey. Are you, yeah, you're ready to go, all yours.
So my name is Tracey Symes. I'm from the School of Nursing and Midwifery and Social Science. And on behalf of my fantastic RHD supervisors, Bobby Harreveld, who's here today, and Tracey Levitt-Jones, we'd like to share with you one of our research themes that have emerged from our research. Research that's been focused on the performance judgments in the work integrated learning environment. When nursing students undertake work integrated learning within Australia, they're supported, supervised and assessed by either a registered nurse that works alongside the student in the clinical area, providing direct care to the patients. They're known as a preceptor. Or a registered nurse has allocated the role of educator that supervises 6 or more students at the healthcare facility at the one time. And this person's often known as the clinical facilitator. The clinical facilitator may observe the student by working directly with them, or may observe performance without direct involvement in patient care. They may seek feedback from others, review written activities, and inquire into performance ability through dialogue with the student. A large amount of research has been undertaken about the role of the registered nurse that works with the student in the preceptor capacity. But there's been very little research undertaken about the clinical facilitator, and only with the occasional reference in relation to how clinical facilitators make performance judgments about students that they're supervising. So what do we know about the students making performance judgments? So we actually know that it's quite difficult. We know that facilitators actually feel underprepared for the role. They doubt their judgment ability and often fail to fail poor performing students. So in 2018, we undertook a qualitative descriptive study that involved the interviewing of 15 clinical nurse facilitators that supervised 6 or more nursing students at one time throughout Australia. The aim of the study was to construct an understanding of how clinical facilitators judge student performance in the work integrated learning setting. A five-phase performance judgment process that was alliterative and reflexive emerged from the research. It was alliterative as it was a continual cycle of the small judgments that were being built upon to inform subsequent performance judgments. It was reflexive as it was affected by multiple changing contextual elements and the interplay of these elements. The importance of understanding performance judgments from a learning and teaching perspective, which is why we're here today, is really to understand that performance judgments inform student performance assessment. The performance assessment is the application of performance judgments against a set criteria. For nursing, that set criteria is Nursing Midwifery Board of Australia, Registered Nurses Standards for Practice. So from the 5-phase performance judgment process, one of 3 themes emerged, which is what we'd like to share with you today. And that is the role of the inner dialogical voice of the clinical facilitator. When facilitators spoke about the inner dialogical voice, 2 categories were identified. The questioning of performance information through varying contextual information, and also the contextual lenses, and number 2 was the recognition and analysis of pattern recognition. So when analysing student performance, the facilitator asks themselves a series of questions. Answers to the questions are drawn from the information that the facilitators collected about the performance. The facilitator questions themselves through 5 contextual lenses. The first contextual lens was that of the facilitator. The facilitator questions their own contextual issues that may impact upon the gathering of performance information or the analysis of this information. Questions facilitators asked themselves were, have they gathered enough information? Do they have enough knowledge to reach a performance judgment about the situation? Is my performance expectation realistic? Am I in the right frame of mind to make this performance judgment? Are there components of myself that may be affecting the student's performance? The second contextual lens was that of the staff. The facilitator questioned if components of the staff context had impact on the student's performance. Questions facilitators asked themselves about the staff context were: does the preceptor performance expectations match mine and that of the education provider? Is the feedback from the preceptor reliable? Has the preceptor provided practice opportunities in space for the student to actually demonstrate performance capability? Are there interpersonal issues, such as personality clashes between the staff and the student, that may actually be affecting the student's performance? The third contextual lens is that of the student. Facilitated questions if the student contextual issues may be affecting student performance. Questions that the facilitator asked about the student context were: does the student have sufficient knowledge and skill? Is there some external student issues that are happening, such as things going on at home, that's affecting the student's performance? Is the student safe, unsafe? Does the student have insight into performance? Does the student have the correct level of confidence? Is the student progressing? Is there progression that matches the stage of the student's study, such as are they performing at third year level? The fourth contextual lens is that of time. The facilitated questions if components of the time context have impacted on the student performance. Questions that the facilitator asks about the time context were: have they had enough time with the facilitators? Have they spent enough time with me? Has the student had enough time to demonstrate performance capabilities? Do I need to spend some more time with the student? What timeframes was that performance information gathered? And how much of my time is that student needed? The fifth contextual lens is that of the education provider. The facilitator questions the components of the education provider, and questions that they ask is the student meeting the learning objectives of the university? Is the student working up to or outside of scope for the unit of study that's being currently undertaken? And is the student meeting professional standards for practice and codes and guidelines for professional practice? If the facilitator is actually unsure of any of these responses to these questions, they then seek to do further action to find the answers. The other category that was found in relation to this internal dialogue, it was behaviour patterns of the students that they recognised. 14 of the 15 facilitators in our study actually acknowledged pattern recognition. 11 facilitators acknowledged the vital role pattern recognition plays for them when they were making performance judgments. Participants acknowledged the experience enabled them to recognise patterns of behaviour, but the experience wasn't just as the facilitator, it was also as being a nurse, a parent, a past student, and really experience in life itself, and that was really important. For meaning to actually be extracted from the recognition of patterns, the facilitator undertakes a dialogue with themselves about how they're feeling, sensing, recognising, and the meaning that this has for them. Pattern recognition is a category of the inner dialogue that is described by participants in a variety of ways. One facilitator described hearing the internal alarm bells. They can't put the jigsaw puzzle together, so then the alarm bell goes off. Another one states, yeah, it's a vibe. The student might just sit there, not say much, not interact with the group, but they might have that, you might have that gut feeling that you're going to have to watch them a little bit more. Participant 11 states, you do develop a sixth sense, an intuition for people and situations. And participant 15 says, you go in, you say, what are your goals today? And if they don't have anything, that's a bit of a flag. And then you might say to them, can you give me a handover on your patient? And they still can't answer your questions about the patient. That's also a bit of a flag. They're not understanding, they're not linking, they're not comprehending. But it also depends on the time of the day that you ask the student this as well. So participant 15 is actually referring us back to the inner dialogue through the lenses that we were speaking about on the previous slide in relation to when the facilitator asks self and considering the contextual lens of time as if we go at the beginning of the shift, should we expect the student to know all this information 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes into a shift versus them being there for 8 hours? We would expect them to have the information. So it's just a very simple demonstration in relation to those contextual lenses and the crossing over of this dialogue between pattern recognition and the contextual questions that facilitators ask themselves. These participants also shared that in orientation to the work integrated learning environment, that they use pattern recognition heavily. They use it to actually plan the clinical allocation, what area the student might work in, who the student might be allocated to work alongside. Pattern recognition tells the clinical educator also who they should prioritise information gathering on or who they think might need extra support.
That's 10 minutes, Tracey.
Yep. Fantastic, thanks. 2 facilitators struggled to validate the role of pattern recognition. One actually said that I've never had the gut feeling, never had the instinct, I can clearly articulate the cumulative things that have happened, and I just think, oh gee. But this participant actually contradicted themselves in following statements and said that you start to gather evidence because you actually know the student's going to fail. So this recognition of OG, and I know the student's going to fail, the participant wasn't actually aware that it was pattern recognition that were guiding their actions. Another clinical educator acknowledged, or facilitator acknowledged, the voice of pattern recognition and felt that that it wasn't valid. And they said that they want to be as neutral as possible when they first come in. And if I have this feeling, I just ignore it. Raising the issues of ensuring objectivity and trying to ignore the subjectivity that occurs with performance judgments. So in summary, internal dialogue is really a vital part of performance judgment process, but there is a misconception that inner dialogue is subjective and should be ignored and is not valid. Facilitators are employed as they have experiential knowledge that informs the inner dialogue. Clinical facilitators need to be empowered to hear, trust, and allow the inner dialogue to guide the performance judgment process. Academics, we need to acknowledge that facilitators' inner dialogue is valid. And we also need to give facilitators permission to listen and share their inner dialogue. Academics themselves need to listen to what the facilitator's inner dialogue is telling them. The power of inner dialogue needs to be harnessed as it provides vital guidance and validation of the performance judgments. Further research is needed to ascertain if failure to fail poor performing students is decreased if both facilitator and academics trust the role of inner dialogue when making performance judgments. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Tracey. That was really interesting. If anyone's got any questions, please either raise your hand or post into the group chat. For me, that was enlightening that people were ignoring that gut feeling. That's actually quite enlightening to me. Perhaps there was, do you think, maybe I should, rather than assume, maybe I should ask the question, do you think that there was a level of confidence there with the lecturer as to their ability to trust that gut instinct that they had?
Yeah, definitely. And that is another category that is coming through in relation to confidence. So there's a category of not only student confidence, but also their own confidence in their own ability. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions of Tracey? Any comments in general for Tracey? You got off easy, Tracey.
Excellent.
All right.
Actually, I have a quick question for Tracey. Sorry, I don't have my video on. I'll put my video on. When you talk about clinical educators making those sorts of judgments, okay, and you're talking about empowering them to listen to their critical dialogue that they're having, it still doesn't necessarily take away all of those factors, like structural factors, in terms of passing students perhaps who might not have reached confidence. I mean, other educators face the same dilemmas in other kind of contexts. So, yeah, how do you deal with those sorts of things? I'm just thinking the pressure to pass a student who you're working with in a clinical situation in order to satisfy the academic institution's expectations, et cetera, et cetera. You know,
I think that the key thing that actually motivated me with this study, and is what we actually found, was that if facilitators listen to this in dialogue early, that then directs their actions. So there was a 5-phase process in relation to judgment processes were made. But if they actually listened to that in a dialogue, 9 times out of 10 they were right. And if they put the actions into place, they were then able to collect this sufficient information or support through remedial activities the student themselves to either make a very informed decision with evidence of the student is a fail or the student is a pass. But often the participants spoke about running out of time because, you know, by the time they realised the student was not performing, it was too late. It was at the end of their placement. Some of our placements, if we're working through graded learning, are up to 2 weeks. So it doesn't allow a lot of time if you're managing, you know, 6, 10 students at one time. But if they trust that in a dialogue, they will actually be right and be able to collect that information and prioritise appropriately.
Thanks, Tracey. I think there's a lesson there for all of us, in terms of trusting our instincts, but also perhaps if we're supervising junior academics as well, and to help them trust their instincts. Does anyone have any other further comments for Tracey? Otherwise, we will move on to the final presentation for this session. Okay, thank you very much. The last session is designing smarter assessments to reduce contract cheating, a case study. Fariza.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my presentation is on the designing smarter assessment to reduce contract cheating. This is not any formal study as such. I just done some experiment of designing some assessment that was for my unit, and I would like to share my experience with you. And first of all, contract cheating, I mean, with the evolution of modern technologies and communication system, it is increasing. And a few weeks back, I read an article on Sydney Morning Herald that one big institution has said that when they have moved their resources from deterrence to detection of contract cheating, they noticed that there is 2,000% rise in contract cheating, which is very alarming. And this is not only one institution, it is everywhere. And so something needs to be done. This is getting alarming. So otherwise it will affect students' learning outcomes, and it's bad for institutional reputation and educational standards, professional practice, and depending on the discipline, public safety as well. So my goal was to, the unit I'm coordinating in previous terms, there were some cases of contract cheating. So my goal was how we can reduce the number of academic misconduct, and specifically I was focusing on contract cheating as well. So I made some changes, and that I would like to share with you guys. And first of all, what is contract cheating? All of you know that contract cheating is in general terms when the student outsource their assessment to a third party, being paid or unpaid, and it could be family members or outside as well. So, and there are a number of factors impacting the contract cheating cases. There are a lot of research going on, and researchers identified that there is a impact, learning and teaching environment has an impact on contract cheating. It is perceived that the students who are dissatisfied with learning and teaching environment might be likely to do cheat in assessments. And there's organizational factors. Students' background also plays a role as well. And another important factor is students' awareness of institutional misconduct policy, and detection method obviously plays a part. And another big important factor is assessment task. So there is relationship between assessment task and how we can reduce the number of contact cheating if we design appropriately. And there are a number of ways in the literature. They have proposed that the number of ways to reduce the number of contact cheating, such as increasing the weightage of in-class tests or reducing the weightage of the uninvigilated task, and reducing the number of unsupervised assignments, and also maybe incorporating viva voce, oral presentation, or practical tasks. So there are a number of ways to do that. And recently there was a study by Tracey and others, and they have run a survey among 14,000 students and also more than 1,100 educators, and they have run the survey and considered 13 assessment tasks, and some of the tasks was perceived by students as more likely to be outsourced and some are less likely to be outsourced. So the more likely outsourced tasks are, for some I mentioned here, which is related to my unit, like heavily weighted tasks are more likely to be outsourced. And if the task has short turnaround time, according to students' perception, that might have more likelihood of being outsourced. Although in the literature it says that reducing the turnaround time might reduce the number of contact cheating, but the study found this is perceived as more likely to be outsourced. And also research, analysis, and thinking type of assessment is more likely to be outsourced. And when there is no right answer, this type of task is also outsourced quite often. And according to student perception, the tasks that are less likely to be outsourced are personalized assessment, in-class tests, viva voce, including viva voce, or reflection on practicum. These are the type of tasks that are less likely to be outsourced. But sometimes, depending on the unit learning outcomes or unit goal, some tasks might be unavoidable, like heavily weighted tasks or research type of tasks, like, for example, my unit, where we have an assessment where it's an individual task and it's a research report that has 40% weightage. Because in this unit, we are teaching students how to do research and how to do the referencing properly and how to gather information. So one of the major assessment is writing a research report. And in this task, we give student a scenario and a research topic. So student does the research on the given topic and provide solution on the of a number of tasks on the given scenario. And student analyze some information, also give their recommendation as well. So this type of task may be likely to be outsourced. So we need to be careful. That's why I was thinking then what to do so that we can reduce the number of contact cheating cases. So in the literature, it says that reflective task is one way to reduce the number of contact cheating cases. But if we incorporate in the report, then if the assessment was outsourced, ghostwriter might be even writing the reflective task as well. So we had to think of how can we avoid that. So we come up with the idea that how about we have the reflective task as an in-class activity. And we also wanted to incorporate the oral discussion, since it was done informally rather than oral defense or viva, we said oral discussion on the reflection of the report that we wanted to take, so that we know that if the student has done the assignment themselves or not. So that's the two parts we have included in my assessment for the unit. And so to do that, first we need to communicate this requirement to the students. So first we had to explicitly mention it in the unit profile, but since it was not done formally, we have mentioned that during the marking, unit coordinator might ask for a oral discussion, and students were advised to save all their drafts and different versions so that if we need, they can provide evidence as well. And in the assessment description, we have clearly mentioned that the requirement on the module side also, we have given clear instruction to the students that about these two tasks will be happening, but the reflective task, we haven't given the questions beforehand. And so unit coordinator, as a unit coordinator, we need to send the student message regularly that these are the tasks. There will be a reflective task and oral discussion in week 11 and week 12. And also lecturers, lecturers also needed to communicate with the students so that student has a clear picture of the tasks that they are supposed to do. And the reflective task, we haven't given the reflective task beforehand, but on the day of the task in class, we gave some questions. And since it was on the trial basis this time, the questions was randomly selected, but as a unit coordinator, I have prepared few questions and I have given the lecturers beforehand, and lecturers randomly asked the questions, a couple of questions to the students, and the questions ranged like critically analyze and write about your experience in preparing this report. And we also asked that what are the key points you have learned from the assessment, and also there were questions on that discuss about your research experience and the hurdle you faced, how you overcome the hurdle. And yes, there are a number of questions we have given to the lecturers beforehand, but the lecturer didn't disclose this to the students. So on the day of the reflective task, when the student took part in it, they had to answer these questions, a couple of questions, and based on their answers and also on the report, there was a oral discussion and viva. So reflective task has been taken in week 11, and oral discussion and viva was in week 11 and 12, and the report was submitted on week 10. So that's how we run the task.
That's 10 minutes, Fariza.
Oh, okay. So the outcome is, this time we haven't detected any contract cheating cases. And so for a big class, like it was over 600 students, which is a quite good outcome. And student attendance also increased in last 2 weeks. In the previous time, we have noticed that once the student submit the final report, the attendance decreases. But since we had the reflective task and the clear message was given to the students that they were encouraged to come to the come and take part in the reflective task. So there was a positive, outcome of this, that students really took it very seriously and they attended the class. So the conclusion, in conclusion, the initial, this was a trial run. We haven't done it formally. So because of the larger class, and for the first time we want to run a trial run, and it was positive, but it's not easy solution. There further works need to be done, and our next task, we are thinking that incorporating this reflective task or viva component formally in the assessment. And we are also thinking another option could be to make this viva a hurdle. That has other sides. We are thinking what to do, but this is now our further next step that we are considering. So that was all. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much. This is a very topical area for us in the university sector. Just, Fariza, I'm just wondering if you could comment. I read an article this week about why students do not engage in contract cheating as opposed to why they do engage in contract cheating. And the findings were they do not engage in contract cheating based on values, traits and personality, which is, kind of obvious really when you think about it. But one of the things was not assessment design. So it wasn't assessment design. So, I think there's multiple things happening here, and that the issue is actually very complex, and the designing of the assessment is part of, I think, an overall response to the issue itself. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it is a very complex issue, but design has some part, but also, as I mentioned, that there is no easy equation, and we need to tell their personality, moral, and ethical value is important. On top of that, our lecturers or educator need to give them a clear idea about the academic misconduct policy, university's policy, and what is the right thing to do, and what are the consequences. That needs to be conveyed to the students correctly as well. So yes, I mean, design, I would say, still has a part, but yes, we need to educate our students as well.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions of Fariza?
Hi, Celeste. I've just got a comment, really, because I was a unit coordinator of that before Fariza took it over, so I feel her struggle with this particular unit. One of the things that earlier in the presentation, Fariza mentioned how we asked the students to keep drafts because we thought if they keep drafts of assessments, that's one way that they can prove that they wrote it themselves. But one of the sneaky things that students used to do is I've seen incidents where they've bought an assignment and they actually put it into the Academic Learning Centre, and they ask them for feedback on it, and then they submit it. So with this one particular student, I remember when I said, I need evidence to show that you wrote it yourself, he pulled out this copy that he'd sent to the Academic Learning Centre, and I thought, oh, okay, maybe he did write it himself. But when you went down and you analysed what the Academic Learning Centre said and what he did to change it, if it was little things like, you know, changing the word or changing the contraction, blah, blah, he did that. But anything to do with the references, he did not do any of their suggestions. So I called him in for an interview, and he knew nothing about the references or anything about them. So that just goes how sneaky they can be with it. So it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jo. Yes, some of the students are very sneaky. Does anyone have any other questions or comments in relation to this presentation? I can't see anyone waving. I can't see any comments. All right, so what we've got a few minutes left. I want to just return, if it's okay with everybody, to Jo's presentation. Jo had to leave us early and has come back now. Jo,
it was a dodgy internet connection that kicked me out.
Yeah, whatever. One of the questions was that you spoke about the integration between the supervisor, the unit coordinator, and the student, and we've got this collaborative approach going on for the confirmation of candidature for higher degree students. There's obviously clear benefits, and you spoke about that, but what are the disadvantages in that approach? I'm particularly thinking of perhaps there's a difference of opinion between the way a supervisor would provide advice and the unit coordinator would provide advice. How did you resolve that?
Thanks, Celeste. Yeah, no, that is a problem. The majority of people do work well with that. Like in my written comments, I will often say, like for example, if I were to say that I didn't think that the research question was clear, I would always, my comments that I put on there, I would always say, please talk this suggestion over with your supervisors, and I will say, you know, blah, 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 whatever it is that I feel about the research question, whether it's not clear or whether it's too huge or whatever it is, I always say to do that. So and you know, when I, in my news forum posts, whatever, I will say, when you have your feedback, you take it back to you, take your feedback, you know, now that I've marked and released all these assignments, take your assignment back to your supervisors and sit with them and talk over it. So because ultimately it's the supervisors who have to sign off to say, yes, this COC is ready to be reviewed. So I always flick it, you know, not flick it back to them, but I always move it back to them that they get the final say on what goes in and what not. I'm just there as an independent reader of that. Does it make sense? Like Susan will often say that the CSEs and the theses for that matter should be able to be read and understood by any intelligent person. You shouldn't need to be like an engineer to read an engineering thesis, or you shouldn't, or a CSE, or you shouldn't need to be, you know, in the creative industries to be able to read and understand a creative industries CSE.
Thanks, Jo.
Yeah.
Any other questions for anybody? If we don't, can I just ask everyone to show their appreciation to all of the presenters here today? So thank you very much, everybody. Really, really wonderful presentations, lots of food for thought. Can I also